Welcome to GulftChats, where stories of the Gulf come alive. From daring voyages to the dynamic history that shaped our coastal world, we bring you first-hand accounts, expert insights, and the timeless tales of sailors, explorers, and maritime pioneers. Welcome aboard.
My name's John Sledge. I'm the historian in residence here at the Maritime Museum. And topic today is not traditionally Gulf Coast topic, really, but it's just something that fired my passion for maritime history from a very young age, and it will touch on the Gulf, as you see. So we're talking about the Battle of Vigo Bay, fire and silver on the Spanish coast. And this painting was really my introduction, age 9 or 10, to Vigo Bay. It's by a Dutch artist. The battle took place in 1702, and it was painted shortly thereafter. And it's really my favorite maritime painting. So this is where I found the painting. This little book, these were great books. I don't know if they still do them or not, for juvenile readers. A lot of my introduction to history came through these. Dad would buy them for me, and I've had this probably 60 years, Pirates of the Spanish Main, but this illustration is in it, talking about the Battle of Vigo Bay, so I just became intrigued by that. And then, of course, Jules Verne made it famous in his 1869 novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And this is my copy of that book, as you can see, well thumbed, much battered. It's been through numerous hurricanes, a pandemic, etc. And, I first read this when I was about 15 or 16 years old, and I had to underline all the words that I couldn't understand, which was practically every other one, because he has all these Victorian terms and maritime scientific that Professor Aronnax likes to throw around. But that's where I learned a little more about the Battle of Vigo Bay. There's a scene where the Nautilus is heading toward northwestern Spain, the northwestern corner, and Captain Nemo calls Professor Aronnax into his study and says, Professor, do you know anything about the history of Spain? And the professor is a bit flummoxed by this, and he said, not something I typically think about. Why? And so then Nemo tells him this long story about Vigo Bay and the background and et cetera. And he said, and by the way, we're about to go in there. And so then in the novel, he has this scene where the captain says, well, Monsieur Aronnax, we are in that Vigo Bay, and it rests with yourself whether you will penetrate its mysteries. The captain rose, telling me to follow him. I had time to recover. I obeyed. The saloon was dark, but through the transparent glass, the waves were sparkling. I looked. For half a mile around the Nautilus, the waters bathed in electric light. The sandy bottom was clean and bright. Some of the ship's crew in their diving dresses were clearing away half-rotten barrels and empty casks from the midst of the blackened wrecks. From these casks and from these barrels escaped ingots of gold and silver, cascades of piastres and jewels. The sand was heaped up with them. Laden with the precious booty, the men returned to the Nautilus, disposed of their burden, and went back to this inexhaustible fishery of gold and silver. It's a marvelous scene, and this was how Nemo funded his eccentric enterprise. Periodically, they would go to Vigo Bay. And of course, in 1954, we have the major motion picture, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I loved that movie. For a long time, there was actually a ride at Disney World where they had this version of the Nautilus that could get on, and it was, I don't know if they still do that, but it was a wonderful ride. This was catnip for an adolescent boy. Of course, it starred Kirk Douglas at his virile peak, and James Mason as Captain Nemo, and Peter Lorre, unforgettably, as Conseil, who was Aronnax's man Friday. And this movie has a vivid scene in Vigo Bay as well. So that really made it world famous. So where is it? What's it about? This is where it's located in northwestern Spain. It's a province called Galicia. And it's not like the rest of Spain. If you think of Madrid and central and southern Spain, Andalusia, where you have plains and, very arid and olive groves. Galicia is actually more like England. It's a moist climate, wet, cool. Perhaps the most famous city there is Santiago de Compostela, which is, of course, the terminus of the famous pilgrimage route that many Catholics still make. And periodically I'll see my Catholic friends on YouTube posting photographs of them somewhere along this route, and it's really always fascinating. It's an amazing place, and it's distinguished by these unusual geographic features. These are they call them rias. We might look at them as bays or inlets that just penetrate into the northwest coast. They might be fed by small streams, but they're not really outlets for rivers. And Vigo Bay there is the southernmost one, right hard by the border of Portugal. So I went there in 1979 because I was studying in Spain, and I still had that youthful obsession with Vigo Bay, and I convinced my girlfriend to go with me. This was not the part of Spain most people were going to, but went and saw Santiago and La Coruña and then Vigo Bay. And here's a modern photograph of it. There's my canceled passport on the right, a much more youthful John Sledge when I had hair and trod a greener and a more innocent earth. And then that fortress is a photograph I took, one of the castillos. Vigo Bay is ringed by fortifications for its defense. That was in '79. So in brief, what happened there was a part of the War of the Spanish Succession, and what that was about was who was going to arise to the throne of Spain. Took place the first bit of the 18th century, and essentially that's the Sun King, Louis XIV, down there in the lower right. Charles II, who was the king of Spain, passed away without an heir. He was not married, he didn't have children, and so he designated Philip of Anjou, who was the nephew of Louis XIV. England and Holland, the Netherlands, objected to that because they thought that would be sort of a Bourbon colossus that they would have to confront, and so they worked against that, and that is what precipitated the war. They did not want Louis's nephew to ascend to the throne, and formed a coalition and went to war. One of those endless European wars that you study in college or high school and can't ever remember what they were all about. But these were the principal players at the top. That's Charles II, Carlos II of Spain, and he had that, they refer to it as the Whopper Habsburg jaw. That was a prominent feature of the men of that family. And you look at that painting and you think it's perhaps no surprise that he never married or had any children, not to be ugly. That's Philip of Anjou there on in the middle. And then, of course, Louis XIV on the right. So the war starts, and a lot of it takes place in Europe. And at that time, the Spanish had holdings in Italy, the Netherlands. So there was a lot of fighting on the European continent. And that's really where the leaders' emphasis and interest lay, because those were where the stakes were highest. However, at the same time, the Spanish and the French, but particularly the Spanish, had large holdings in the West Indies, one of which was, of course, the island of Cuba and the city of Havana. And here we see a map, of course, and then there's an image of Havana from about the time Mobile was founded in 1702, and the artist was Northern European, and you can tell it looks like a Dutch or a German village, and it would have looked nothing like that, but he was correct in depicting that big boom chain, that anchor across the mouth of the harbor. And that was to defend against pirates. Every night they would essentially close the city. They'd lock the city gates on the inland side and raise that big anchor chain, so any ships that wanted to get into the harbor had to wait for morning. In fact, Havana, to this day, they have a ceremony at the Morro Castle there at the mouth of the harbor, where Spanish soldiers, or rather Cuban soldiers dressed in 18th century attire, fire off a gun, which was the announcement at 9 p.m. that the gates would all close and tourists and all that go, at least when they had tourists. So what happened, the reason Havana was so important, it was very rich, it was called the bulwark of the Indies, the gem of the Antilles. This was really the gathering place for the Spanish treasure fleets. And what they would do is they would leave Spain, two fleets, the Flota and the Galeon was what the two fleets were called. One would come through the Caribbean, call at places like Cartagena, Portobello, loading up on silver from those incredibly productive Spanish silver mines in Peru, particularly in Potosi. And then they'd go up to Havana and wait, and then the other fleet would come across and go straight to Veracruz in Mexico. And at Veracruz, they would load up on stuff that had been brought from China and the East aboard the Manila galleon. And it would come once a year, dock on the Pacific shore of Mexico, and then they'd take mules and wagons and haul all the treasure across to Veracruz, loaded on the Spanish ships. Then they'd go to Havana from there. They would meet there and then sail across the Atlantic together for better security using the Gulf Stream, basically as a big slingshot. Interesting, the route of the fleet through the Gulf when they left Havana particularly, or rather when they left Veracruz to go to Havana, that portion of the fleet, because of the Gulf Loop current, the way it would work, they would often end up sailing way indirect route. They'd come up the west coast of Mexico and then hook around along the southern littoral of what's now the United States, and then ride the current down the Florida shore and then into Havana. So all of which is to say is that if you lived on Dauphin Island at any time between 1600 and 1800, you could well have seen the sail stacks of galleons out in the Gulf that were riding the Gulf Stream if it happened to be up that, or the loop current if it happened to be that far north. And then here at the bottom is an artist representation of Havana, the harbor, the galleons and ships waiting. So in the summer of 1702, you have a large treasure fleet that's gathering in Havana, protected by French warships, because they're loosely allied now and about to become more closely allied. And these ships have been picking up it's been 3 years since the last treasure fleet. So all this stuff is accumulated in these places and they're loaded to the gills. So we have 17 Spanish galleons, most of which were owned by private merchants. King of Spain only owned like 3 of them. And then 23 ships of the line, which was what they referred to as the warship. We'd call it a battleship today. These could have anywhere from 64 to 80 or 100 guns, 3 long tiers of guns. The lower deck, maybe 32 pounders, then 12 pounders, maybe 6 pounders. A lot of firepower and throw weight. The French commander was François-Louis Rousselier de Chateaurenaud. Forgive me if my pronunciation is not super good there. And then the Spanish commander who commanded the galleons was Don Manuel Velasco y Tejada. And he was a member of the Order of Santiago, which is a military religious order that went back to the Middle Ages, very prestigious. Both of these men were veterans. They'd been in the service quite a while. They were not neophytes, so they were competent and the fleet was in good hands. So what they had, we tend to think of galleons as carrying gold and silver, the traditional idea of booty and silver. And here we see some imagery of gold coins and gold bars and silver bars. And there was plenty of that, heaven knows, probably more silver than anything. But they also carried other goods that were incredibly valuable: pearls, amethyst, emeralds, pepper, cinnamon, sugar. Of course, the Indies were incredibly rich, and Europeans could not get enough of sugar. Think of tea in the East India Company, and of course the Boston Tea Party much later. Wool, cotton, tobacco, indigo. Incredibly valuable, all of this stuff, and a lot of it, most of the gold and silver was going to the Spanish king and the crown, but a lot of that other stuff had been purchased by Dutch and British merchants, and they were anxiously awaiting its delivery. The fleet was supposed to go to Cadiz, Spain, down in the southwest corner of the country. But as this massive assemblage is making its way across the Atlantic, the war's been declared. The British besiege Cadiz. They take a fleet down there, and it drags on for months. And the the Spanish king orders fast sloops, schooners, to go and alert the treasure fleet that it's got to come somewhere else besides Cadiz. They need a new locale. They'll be sailing right into capture if they head for Cadiz. So here's a view of another view of Vigo Bay, and that this would be their destination. That's what they decided on. Chateau Renaud actually wanted them to go to a French port a little further north, but the Spanish vetoed that because they understood that what would happen is Louis XIV would take all the treasure and the Spanish would be left holding the bag. So they insisted on the Spanish port. They chose Vigo Bay. Here's an image to the right showing San Simon Bay, which is this. This is all Vigo Bay. You can see it's quite deep. And they get way up that little part there. So this is about 20 miles long. And San Simon Bay is that portion up there. And that's where the fleet actually pushed into. The Spanish and French ships, for their protection, got all the way back up in there. So you couldn't see them from the shore, from the islands, the Atlantic. It would have been very difficult to know that there was an entire fleet waiting in there. So the Spanish got busy. As soon as they realized this fleet is not going to be able to unload at Cadiz, they sent all the stuff they needed to Vigo Bay to unload it. Now, there were a lot of logistical problems with that. Spanish bureaucracy was unbelievable. Everything in triplicate makes the U.S. Air Force look like a high school lemonade stand. And that's great for historians because they're all kind of documents that you can now retrace this stuff by. So the Spanish didn't have any of the infrastructure in Vigo Bay. Vigo itself, the town for which the bay was named, was a little fishing hamlet, maybe 2,000 residents. They needed cranes, they needed wharves, they needed warehouses, they needed personnel, plus all the bureaucratic apparatus that made that work. You know, clerks and treasurers and, accountants and just legions of functionaries. They didn't have any of that. That ended up being an advantage for the Spanish because what happened, imagine this, all the corruption that would have gone with that system, everybody kind of taking, they won't miss a few coins here and there. So they were able to unload more of the actual silver than they perhaps would have been. They sent simple wooden ox carts from all over Spain, such as the one to the right. These clunky things with wooden wheels, not very maneuverable or certainly comfortable to ride in. And the Crown promised the drivers a ducat a league. If you've got to travel 20 or 30 or 40 leagues, and a league then was a couple of English miles. So they were going to be well paid for their efforts. So they converged, this sort of informal army of cart drivers and laborers converges on Vigo, and they sort of put together this ramshackle system of docks and cranes to start unloading these ships as fast as they can. Let's get the silver and the gold off quickly as we can. Fortunately, San Simon Bay is fairly deep on the portions next to the southern shore, so they were able to get the ships very close to it for unloading. Meanwhile, the British and Dutch force under the command of Admiral George Rooke, in his 50s, a blooded veteran, he had fought at the Battle of Solé Bay in 1672 against the Dutch, with whom he was now allied, was commanding the British-Dutch force off Cadiz. His flagship was the HMS Royal Sovereign, and he commanded 30 British ships, 20 Dutch ships. And these are ships of the line, the big battleships. Also lots of transports with 14,000 infantry, because it was basically what we would call today an amphibious assault of Cadiz. In addition to these, ships of the line, they had sloops and schooners and small boats, and so there were dozens of craft associated with both these fleets. And that's the view, of course, of the Royal Sovereign. You just get some sense of her towering majesty. He had very capable commanders under him, James Butler, the second Duke of Ormond, was in command of the infantry contingent, and that included a detachment of the Coldstream Guards. So these were crack troops. And then Admiral Thomas Hobson there on the right actually commanded the British warships and was directly under Rooke, and he would really have a direct role in whatever part the Navy played. So here we are in Cadiz, southwest portion. The British-Dutch besiege it, and it isn't going very well. They lost a lot of landing craft trying to land. The surf was rough, men were drowned. Then they got ashore. It was marshy. The climate was harsh. The troops took a little Spanish village. Predictably, they got drunk. Then they looted the churches and chased the nuns around town, and it was just a disaster. The Spanish sort of rose up against them en masse, and what looked to be a fairly straightforward conquest became anything but. Why were the British and Dutch at Cadiz? Because they felt that if they could take that, they could convince the Portuguese, who were not yet on either side, to throw their lot in with them and provide them a base in southern Portugal, and then they could project power into the Mediterranean, threaten Toulon in southern France, which was a major naval base. But Cadiz is going terribly. Finally, the British give it up, August of 1702, and then they get word that there's this massive treasure fleet coming. And Rooke decides, we've got to find them, figure out where that is, and take them. That'll sort of redeem all this blood and treasure that's been wasted here on this futile siege. So meanwhile, the British don't know where the Spanish and the Dutch are, but one of the British frigates puts in a little Portuguese port called Lagos, take on water. They were always having to get supplies and things. And so the chaplain, so sort of this 1950s illustration here, but you get the point. The chaplain is hanging out at a wharfside tavern, as perhaps a chaplain should not be, unless he's looking for lost souls or beautiful serving girls who will pay attention to him. And he hears sort of one of the Frenchmen blabbing on about, oh, we've got this great big treasure fleet up here at Vigo Bay, and they'll never find us, and aren't we wonderful? You know, tavern gossip, if you will. He cocks an ear and reports it immediately to his captain. And so now Rooke knows where they are. And the plan is, let's go get them, as the Confederates under Longstreet would have said. So Rooke calls a council of war on his flagship, and as he said, determined that we make the best of our way to the port of Vigo and insult them immediately with our whole line. So that's the plan. Here you can see Vigo and some of the defenses around it. They have, this is called the Rand Stretch right here. It's about 600 yards wide. In Spain, they call this La Batalla del Rande, rather than Vigo Bay as we would today. So that's where the fleet is. They're going to go get them. And the Spanish have fortresses all around this bay. So here's an overview of the beginning of the battle, and you get a sense of Rooke's plan. That's the Spanish-French fleet to the left, British and Dutch coming into the entrance of the bay. They got in very easily. They made the French-Spanish made no attempt to defend the mouth of the bay. They sailed right in the fog. They breezed right past Vigo. A few guns fired at them, didn't have any effect, and they got right up to this boom chain. And similar to Havana, the Dutch and Spanish had constructed this chain as a barrier across the stretch there to protect their fleet. It was probably about 9 feet in diameter. It was this big, hulky thing, sort of ebbing, bobbing up and down with the swells there. Consisted of chains, hawsers, barrels, boxes, any and everything that they could sort of throw at it just to make this big junk chain going across the mouth. Behind it, you had the French ships of the line and a big crescent with the broadsides facing out, and then you had a lot of the treasure ships peppered around inside under their protection. So Rooke decided that what we'll do is we'll land the Coldstream Guards and the other infantry there on the land side there at the top center, and we'll take some of these fortifications from the land side, and then our main ships will go in and attack the boom chain. And because it's so tight, we can't send our whole fleet, so we'll send maybe 10 British and 10 Dutch ships or something like that. We'll have a piece of the force go in. It was a good plan as far as it went. It made sense. So the first element is the Duke of Ormond's troops land there on the shore. The troops they were facing were not hardened Spanish soldiers. They were basically militia, not very reliable, not particularly well armed, probably a lot of civilians. So they weren't going to be of much use in a stand-up fight. The Duke of Ormond's men very quickly subdue one of these fortresses, raise the British flag, and of course the British jack tars and the Dutch see this and cheer wildly. The next element of the plan, since things are going so well on shore, and this may have been 2,000, 3,000 British troops that did this, it wasn't a massive force, was the British and Dutch ships slam into the boom chain. The lead ship was the HMS Torbay, which was this massive British warship of 80 guns. And you also had men in small boats, Dutch sailors would get out with hatchets, boarding hatchets, and wang away on this boom chain to try to make it easier to get across and engage directly with the enemy ships inside. Here's an early painting of the battle. You can see we're looking from the British-Dutch perspective into Saint-Simon Bay. You can see the fortresses around the bay firing and the Spanish and French ships waiting the attack. And then here's a modern digital artist. I'm not sure what that means, but this is probably a pretty good idea of the chaos that ensued once the British and the Dutch got in there. It became a very close quarters kind of slugfest. The sky would have darkened. You know, it's early morning, it's a cloudy day, but you had all this gunpowder. If you've ever seen a black powder weapon, such as at the Blakely reenactment, you know, they call them smoke wagons. They really just throw out a lot of smoke, and it would have obscured so much. So these ships are firing at point-blank range, and the British excel at this. The British gunnery of the time was to fire at the hull of the vessel to try to sink it. French methodology was to sort of fire on the uproll and disable their rigging and sails if they couldn't maneuver. But in this kind of environment, it was the British tactic was much more effective. So very quickly, Chateau Renaud saw that they were not going to prevail. So he ordered his men to, burn the ships. Let's destroy them so they won't be of any use to the British. So the Duke of Ormond is watching all this from one of these fortresses, and he says, what's going on now is the Spanish and French are working as hard and fast as they can to destroy their own ships. Our men are working as fast and hard as they can to save the enemy ships, and they're not even fighting each other except when they sort of have to. They're trying to stay out of each other's way to save as many or destroy as many ships as possible. In the case of the HMS Torbay, she's the lead British ship. A French fire ship got alongside her. This was a vessel that would have carried, faggots and bundles of wood and things like that could be set on fire and jeopardize the ship it was attacking. The fire ship was actually loaded with snuff. So what happens, to everybody's surprise, the fire ship gets alongside the Torbay and the snuff explodes. So you have this boom, this massive eruption of, you can imagine, snuff. I guess it's a high school athlete's dream. Skull, brother. The snuff just comes raining down on the Torbay. One of the Torbay's sailors that says that, one of her gun ports was blued off and her front yard was burnt to a coal. But other than that, not significant damage. It just surprised everybody. And a lot of British sailors jumped into the water in their shock and surprise, and unfortunately were drowned. But the upshot was that the British won a complete, and the Dutch, and total victory. They either sunk every ship there or captured it, or it was destroyed or burnt by the French-Spanish. And so some of the vessels survived intact. One was the San Cristobal de Maracaibo, which the British captured and tried to tow out. She was loaded with treasure. Tried to tow her out back to England. These are the Sieyès Islands, which are at the mouth of Vigo Bay. There are several of them. They're about 600 feet in height, so that further helped obscure what was going on in the bay, but very rocky and treacherous. And unfortunately, the Maracaibo hit a rock as the British were towing her out, and she sank with all that treasure aboard. When news of this great victory arrived in Holland and England, there was jubilation. Here we see an image on the left of celebrations at The Hague in Holland, where they have fireworks and music and everything else. And then on the right, a special commemorative coin that the British Crown cast out of silver from the Battle of Vigo Bay. The key question becomes, how much silver did the Spanish salvage before the British got there? How much was lost? How much did the British take back? There are imprecise amounts for all of that. The general estimates are that the Spanish crown got about 340 tons of silver. Immense. This is probably the most valuable return they got from hundreds of years of treasure fleet activity. The British might have salvaged as much as 2 tons. Enough to do commemorative coins and maybe pay off a few bills at Buckingham Palace. And the rest would have been sunken, but how much the rest constituted, nobody has ever really known. We do know that the things like the snuff or the tobacco, the cinnamon, the sugar, the wool, all those other goods were totally lost, consumed in the fires or ruined when the vessel sank. So the biggest losers in this entire debacle were the British and Dutch investors, oddly enough, in Antwerp and Amsterdam that were waiting for this stuff, and the French king, who lost 23 ships of the line, the devastating financial loss for the French crown. The Spanish came out sounding like a rose. Philip got one of the largest hauls of silver ever, and he only owned 3 of the ships, so the rest were owned by private Spanish merchants. So he ended up coming out pretty well. Incidentally, you can get Vigo Bay coins on the internet. They're pretty expensive. They're a very desirable trade item, and I'm sure there's a healthy market in pirated or knockoff examples as well. So San Simon Bay is deep, but it's not super, super deep, 20, 30, 40 feet. And many of the wrecks were actually like this. They projected, their upper works and masts and so forth up above the water, similar to some of the Union ironclads that sank during the Battle of Blakely. You read about how they went down, but their turrets were still above the water. So for the men, all they had to do was stand on top of that, and they weren't going to drown. The actual casualties of the battle, again, wildly different estimates. The high is 2,000 for the Spanish, French, and maybe 800 for the Dutch, English. I think that's probably a high number. A more likely figure might be, say, 200 for the Spanish, French, maybe 150 or something like that for the British. So I think this battle would have looked and sounded a lot worse than it actually was in terms of loss of life. Not that any wasn't terrible, but it was not devastating in terms of manpower for either side. So what happens in the decades and centuries after Vigo Bay is people are sort of crazed by this idea of let's salvage that silver. And of course, after Verne's novel in '69, that just ramps all that up even more, because now people have this vivid idea of what that could mean. And so here you see some sort of Victorian examples of early attempts at salvage and diving, and some really ingenious contraptions where they would go down and search these wrecks. In Vigo Bay, the bottom is not sort of a pristine kind of sand the way you might have off Gulf shores or something. There's a lot of mud in there, so stuff would have been covered, and the visibility would not have been good, and it would have been a very difficult environment. It wasn't just treasure chests sitting on top of the sand. Here's some other examples. There were literally dozens of attempts to salvage treasure over the years. Here we see like stock for a Vigo Bay Treasure Company, more sort of outlandish designs and schemes, and none of them came up empty-handed. They found, as we see there, cannon, barnacle-encrusted bottles, china, silver, iron equipment, just anything. And these ships had all kind of stuff, but actual coins, actual treasure, very little of any of that. And then even as late as the 1950s, we see this book, The Treasure Divers of Vigo Bay, The Adventures of an Irrepressible Team of Young Frogmen. That's not a term you hear anymore. This was written in the 50s, in search of the world's greatest sunken riches. They, again, they didn't find much, some archaeological stuff. And this makes archaeologists crazy because, of course, they're sort of destroying the context of a lot of this stuff for later sleuths and scholars. What this team did do that was of value is they actually found the wreck of the Maracaibo that had sunk out there by those islands. So they identified where that was. So in more modern times, you have much more sophisticated archaeological projects that go on both underwater and on land. Here we see the bridge over the Rand Stretch, and archaeologists, of course, this is all done by government permit. There isn't any fly-by-night cowboy kind of operation going on, and these results are published and cataloged and placed in museums, such as the Galician Sea Museum. This did not exist when I was there, but I wish it had, because it's obviously very well done. They interpret not only this particular battle, but the long history of Vigo Bay before and after. And then lastly, the legacy of the man that made it so famous. This is a monument to Jules Verne that was placed by the Pontevedran Ladies Society in the early 2000s. I would love to see this. And here we see him contemplating the scene, holding one of his works upon the tentacles of a cephalopod. Maybe it's a giant squid, such as attacks the Nautilus in that climactic scene in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So I think that's a perfectly appropriate coda to hold that whole legacy and that whole story that Verne made so famous. Incidentally, Verne himself did visit Vigo Bay. He had his own yacht, not surprisingly, and pulled in there for a time, and they had a parade for him, really treated him like quite the celebrity. So that is a very rough overview of the Battle of Vigo Bay. Hope you've enjoyed it. Happy to entertain any questions, and if you've never been there, I'd encourage you to go. It's a beautiful place. The cuisine is excellent, seafood, people are warm, and it has an amazing history. Thank you all so much. Hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate it.